Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining. It's great to see you all here. I will kick us off right on time as we started the recording. Hello and welcome to our session on AI in the humanitarian sector. I'm Elizabeth Shaughnessy. I'm going to be your host for the discussion today. We've got an excellent panel of experts who I'm excited to introduce you to. So just to kind of kick things off, again, welcome. We have with us today Bill Clinton Awiti, who is a computer scientist and Salesforce architect serving as technical projects and Salesforce lead at the START Network. In this role, he leads Salesforce and other technical projects that strengthen systems, AI and data use, and collaboration across START Network's global membership. Bill has a got to pop up. Bill has a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science, a master's degree in Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence, and is an ITIL certified project lead. So welcome, Bill, to the panel. We also have with us today Kuldeep Bandhu Aryal, who is a senior manager and co-lead of the Social Innovation Lab at BRAC, and who is the chair of the UK Humanitarian Innovation Hub Advisory Group. He has nearly a decade of experience in innovation management within the humanitarian and development sectors, with expertise in leveraging social innovation, human-centered design, and the application of frontier technologies to address challenges faced during humanitarian crises. Welcome, Kuldeep. And lastly, we have Dr. Shyam Krishna, who is a research leader at RAND Europe, specializing in AI governance and emerging technologies. Previously a program specialist in UNESCO's Ethics of AI unit and a researcher at the Alan Turing Institute, he works with governments worldwide to design rights-based practical AI policy. He leads collaborations across Europe, Asia, and Africa, advising multilateral bodies and national agencies on AI standards, capacity building, and implementation. And I had to remind myself in my notes to introduce myself. So I will be your host for this discussion. My name is Elizabeth Shaughnessy. I am the Director of Digital Programming at NetHope. I lead programs focused on connectivity and emergency response, digital transformation for local nonprofits, and the use of AI in humanitarian efforts, supporting our network of over 60 INGO members. So again, thank you for joining. I'm really excited for our conversation today. Before we get started, I wanted to just start with a brief introduction, looking back in particular at the past year of AI in the humanitarian sector to help set the scene. The humanitarian sector, as we know, have seen significant advances in its use of AI over the last year, with both notable opportunities as well as risks. And we've also seen successes and failures come out of this. In particular, when we're talking successes, we're seeing AI-powered early warning systems, disaster prediction tools. These are becoming more reliable, and we're seeing them throughout preparedness and response operations, especially for natural disasters and disease outbreaks. We're seeing the adoption of AI for reporting and information management. And it really means that humanitarian teams in the field spend less time on sort of back office tasks and more on that direct impact. With these successes, we're also seeing emerging opportunities. We're seeing participatory AI models, collective crisis intelligence methods, which are really enabling communities themselves to help shape and validate critical information, improve trust, and improve that contextual relevance. We're also seeing an increase in individual use within organizations, so using AI in our own work day to day, which really also opens the door to grassroots innovation, even if organizational strategy and infrastructure are perhaps slower to that wider pickup, which is very exciting. Unsurprisingly, and if you've been in these conversations before, you will have been in this particular conversation around the challenges, the risks, the failures, and so on. While individual practitioners are using AI tools, many organizations lack the infrastructure, the policies, or the technical capacity for safe and sustainable deployment. Concerns about data privacy, algorithmic bias, and access inequities continue to persist. Notably, for instance, we have large language models with the promise of global translations, but in reality, the gaps in appropriately contextualizing these models means that many of these services are not fit for purpose. So overall, we're seeing that we have been on a hype cycle for a few years now, and while I don't think we're quite past that, we are certainly seeing that AI is not a panacea, and practitioners are calling for robust evaluation and transparency into the development and application of these tools. Classic digital transformation challenges are also present with AI, in particular upfront costs, vendor lock-in, which is often in conflict with funding opportunities available to our sector. And it would be remiss of me not to point out the other risks around AI, perhaps outside of our direct operations and programming as well. For instance, mis and disinformation campaigns and the impact that that has on our work and the broader political environment, the climate impact of AI, simply typing into one of these large language models, and concerns around employment and skills, just to name a few. So, really looking across the digital divides that we're seeing around the world and the widening gap in many of these cases. Now, all of this, of course, sits within an increasingly stressed sector. This year in particular, we've seen devastation to global funding of humanitarian aid and an increase in the complexity of the crises that we're facing. So to move this forward, we are seeing sector-wide initiatives and networks really lean into these challenges. We have, the Safe AI framework that's supported by the UK government. We have multi-agency webinars and dialogues. We have this dialogue today, which I'm excited to get started on. NetHope itself has a working group with over 300 group members, for example. And all of this really illustrates a growing emphasis on establishing standards, collaboration, and ethical assurance for AI in humanitarian action. Networks are forming to share lessons, tools, and best practices, aiming to produce more collective benefit from AI innovation. So we wanted this discussion to try and address some of these challenges and explore these opportunities in more depth. To do that, I would really encourage our audience to use the chat to ask questions and add comments. Thankfully, we have Zofia and Derek from the START Network here who are supporting with moderating the chat, and we'll be trying to pull in your comments and questions as we go. We are covering a lot today, and we only have the hour, so I do apologize in advance if we don't get to your question, but please do engage with others there in the chat. I think we will have a very, very lively conversation today. So with that in mind, to kick things off, we're going to start with our first question, which is on AI in practice. So really grounding the application of AI in our practice every day. As I mentioned, AI is already in use, both in the sort of back office operations as well as programmatic use, from data-driven decision-making, reporting, information management, to early warning systems, and so on. We're certainly seeing a lot of generative AI use in particular, with large language models being used to create content, translate or attempt to translate, and so on. So for field teams working in highly dynamic contexts, there is certainly a challenge around what the responsible use of AI actually looks like in practice. So as we sort of answer these questions, we're going to consider where AI has already influenced decision-making in humanitarian response and what went right or wrong in these experiences. So enough of me talking. I'm now going to hand over to Bill. Bill, how do technical limitations, for example, data quality, bias, connectivity, shape what's realistic in local contexts?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth, for that powerful introduction. I think, the highlights you've given almost sums up what I could say as an answer to my question. Speaking to it, I think it's already mentioned that data quality is a big thing. And it's public knowledge that in humanitarian contexts, for example, where we work in, the biggest limitation around AI would be this one factor, data quality. Since a lot of information that we have is quite patchy and inconsistent. And borrowing from computing knowledge, garbage in, garbage out, if AI learns from that, it risks giving a lot of skewed answers, for lack of a better term. And that's why improving the way we store and structure data is important as building the AI itself. And this, stems from as granular levels as the individual organizations, and to us as a sector in the aid and the charity world. I think that is on data quality. Other things like connectivity, also pose a very great challenge. Just asking this when we are from an implementation in Zimbabwe, which was in the field, and we clearly saw what connectivity, can how much connectivity can be a hindrance to some of the usage of these tools, uptake of these tools. In many crisis zones that we work in, internet is quite unreliable, so we can't assume responders have access to heavy cloud-based systems, as maybe the people who are joining this call here today. AI tools, I think, in my perspective, will need to be light and accessible, even with weak connections that we experience in those areas, because we can't say we want to wait until those areas get better connectivity for them to experience, the full use or the full adoption of AI. And finally, just to keep this very lean, bias. Speaking to that, many tools that we have seen are trained on data from the global north, which doesn't always reflect local realities. I mean, in our pre-discussions yesterday, before we came to this panel, we had members speak more to this, and that's where networks like Start Network ours can really help. The likes of NetHope, to speak, for example, by making sure AI is trained on diverse, local, relevant data that really speaks to these populations of the places that we work. Just to contextualize, at Start Network, our idea is to use AI not to make the decision, but to quickly bring the right information to the table, so that responders, can still make the call. Back to you, Elizabeth.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I think a really good introduction to the sort of the technical challenges and how we're trying to approach this as we move, more into the practical application of AI. I think especially that phrase "garbage in, garbage out." I want to put that on T-shirts and just hand that out to everyone I meet. I hear it a lot, and I think it's just incredibly relevant. And I think that even before we got on this sort of hype train around AI, we were seeing concerns around data quality, but also data sharing, data portability. And those problems haven't gone away. If anything, they've been amplified with trying to now access AI tools without having sufficient or the right data to be feeding into those tools. So sort of following along this line, Kuldeep, if I could ask you, what lessons can organizations draw to avoid so-called pilot traps, and instead really integrate AI meaningfully, both in the short term and the longer term?
Hi, thank you. I think there is this term that I tend to use called pilotitis, especially in large organizations where there is multiple pilots running at the same time, there isn't a mechanism to sort of one, control, regulate, and also create meaningful success indicators, especially if not for long-term projects, identify early success indicators that would help people to also pivot. We have to understand that unlike other digital transformation initiatives, AI, even the technology developers are also experimenting with AI. And that means that we have to have the flexibility to pivot, but with data and evidence while these things are being developed. So in a traditional humanitarian sector, you would assume that you have a project cycle, a 12-month, and you work with that one idea. But the idea of pivoting really does not come at all within the team that is implementing these pilots. And I think that is one of the major traps that we feel that, I mean, if we can expect OpenAI or Anthropic, everyone to develop new features and improvements every 4 months, we cannot get into this mindset that has to be 12 months, and then in between that time, whatever we're doing has to be what it was initially designed as. So we have to bring in that agility in the same pace and manner as the technology developers, since we're in a very different arena, unlike the digital transformation era that we had experienced.
Thank you. That's also really good points. I think it's really interesting to hear you say, as the technology is being developed by, oftentimes these are global north actors and big tech companies, but they're also being, found in local markets and local development agencies. And I think that being able to see that as an opportunity as well, that, there's obviously risks involved with experimentation and innovation, of course, that we absolutely want to be mindful of, but having the opportunity to dive in as it's being developed, not just applying it, but designing it as well, I think is a really interesting and crucial point, actually.
Yeah, we have to take charge of our use cases. Unlike previous cycles, we were dependent on the technology developers creating use cases for us, and we had to mold our setting into that use case. In this, we have an opportunity to develop our own use cases that is not driven by the technology developers, and that is more driven by the community, that is driven by the needs and frontline workers on the ground. And that means that there is more opportunity for innovation as well as experimentation, but not driven by the technology companies, but by the humanitarian sector itself.
Absolutely. That's absolutely a good point too. I know we're going to dig into this even more in our next question. So I want to hand over to Shyam. Can you tell me, and we're seeing a lot of questions actually pop up into the chat about this, so I think it's definitely a relevant next question, which is, how do AI policy and ethics fit into all of this from your point of view?
Sure. And thank you, everyone. I think the stage has been set perfectly to kind of come in and give a more reliable answer without having to go into specifics, thankfully for me, because what I would suggest is policy and ethics kind of could operate in any given situation at two different levels. Policy, looking at it as an alignment from the international political treaty politics, but also the governance framing that largely comes from international bodies involved in AI. But in case of the humanitarian sector, or what comes out of that particular sector as well, and ethics can be more in practice on how this is connected along with policy alignment. Where I see, I can give you a couple of examples. Impact assessment, this is not new. It's been done multiple times in multiple different digital data era, as well as especially in this sector. What I see here is it's more a requirement for algorithmic impact assessment or ethical assessment of AI specifically need to be part of the pilot culture. So much as what we were talking about, pilot trapped and pilot-itis, that doesn't flow well. That has to kind of address the lack of impact assessment, because impact assessment set the stage for marrying what is too abstract at a policy level to what practice can be within a specific use case. And there is also a possibility to map out what human touch points look like, whether authorization and red lines need to be in place, on whether this is a very weird word to say, a human panel could look at it and decide, rather than just an algorithmic kind of workaround on that. And this would also give us a good way to ensure mapping of existing channels like SMS, IVR, WhatsApp, other kind of like survey modes that feed data into the AI ecosystem. That would be a very good place. This again matches data provenance, data governance issues, which are done quite very well in the sector, but now moving that into the AI ethics space. And lastly, it is about kind of like aligning to existing kind of multilateral spaces like the OCHA's humanitarian data exchange policies, and also kind of aligning with more nuanced take on AI, like UNESCO or OECD principles, because the technology itself would be aligned to only one of those. The aim for the organization is to see whether impact assessment and tools like that can marry both of these kind of parallel tracks together in how it is implemented as an ethical policy in practice for the tool and the context in question.
Thank you. I think when you lay it all out like that, I feel like, okay, great, let's do it. And then trying to implement that in practice is definitely another thing. I wanted to just take a couple of minutes and come to our audience. We've had quite a few questions coming through around ethics and data privacy. I think you've started to touch on that, and I know we're going to dive deeper into that side of things as well in future questions. I actually wanted to go to Jana's question. Sophia or Derek, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Yeah, I can read it out for you. So thinking of a traditional 12-month project cycle versus needing to be able to apply new opportunities or features much more quickly and being agile raises the question of what's the right balance. How much time do we spend figuring out how to launch a new thing versus discarding that and jumping into the next thing, and not only getting sucked into the shiny object syndrome?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. It's a great question, and I think I'm coming away with a lot of really great phrases, including shiny object syndrome. So that's really great. Kuldeep, do you want to have a stab at this question?
Yes, I agree with Shyam about adding the layer of ethical and policy implications at the start, as the pilot goes, and that I think almost everyone misses. We don't have the capacity inside the organizations to even look at it. So I think this needs to be figured out on a humanitarian level and a multi-organizational level to look at AI ethics, because it's too expensive to hire someone like Shyam to look at all of our pilots' interventions every time, right? And with relating to the pilot design, what we need to think of, what I have sort of used is this thinking around AI complete, meaning that we design use cases and we design feature set which would continue to improve as underlying AI improves, while keeping things above relatively the same. What that would mean is that only certain elements would be more would be more volatile compared to others. And then we can also create structures and feature set within the solution to either check the negative impact of that AI improvement, or improvement as the companies would say, but whether there's a feature, or amplify them, right? So thinking around, that we cannot design for now what the AIs are going to be, right? What the AIs are capable now. We have to really dig into where these technology developers are looking at, reasoning models, for example, how they're looking at reasoning and multi-agent, and then how to either amplify some of the good ones, and why also curb down some of the negative negative capabilities, while these AI models improve continuously. We're seeing them to be improving every 4 months now, right? The size and scale, and we have to be able to respond to that. It's one is about okay, we have to be agile and respond to take advantage, but also while that is happening, we have to also be agile and responsive to understand the risk, and then create systems that do not perpetrate further those risks.
Thank you for that, Kuldeep. I think that is an excellent segue actually into our next question, and wholeheartedly agree. So on risks and also following that on accountability, we often hear about risks around AI, as I said, earlier, relating to bias and misuse of data. But for local actors in particular, there are even more complex risks around exclusion, dependency, decision-making, and other things. Even just a product not working for the local communities can be a much more high-risk and significant problem than it would be for perhaps others that tool is designed for. So how do we ensure that AI strengthens community-centered approaches to problem solving? In particular, I'm thinking about where there are certain power dynamics between big tech companies, global north companies that are driving a lot of this product development, which we talked a little bit about earlier. And we're also thinking about questions around what mechanisms can field teams in particular use to validate or challenge AI systems and outputs with lived experiences from the communities that we're working with. And in this, kind of also thinking about what safeguards are needed. We talked a little bit as we were designing this session about how to, it's not just about what safeguards, but how to have people care about the safeguards as well and prioritize that, making sure that local organizations and communities have agency over how AI is used and the impacts that it has. So a broad topic area. So over to Shyam again. Can you dive more into what real risks have emerged already? If you have, for instance, accountability frameworks that you can refer to, that what frameworks for accountability are needed to really mitigate this risk or these risks and ensure that these power dynamics are kept in check?
Sure. Thank you. The larger AI narrative it's a critical balance between risk orientation and a normative take on ethics, uh, or largely more broadly defined as safety in the AI space. And this is kind of led between governmental policy making, international policy making, and response to that in AI governance by technology providers. So there is a larger risk at for the sector as whole, at an exclusionary risk in not being at the table, and then potentially because of this larger level of exclusion, this flows down to kind of use cases and community level on exclusion, like missing models, missing dialects, languages, the vocabulary that would be required for field operators, or kind of like other proxy data that would be needed for spatial modeling, like locations may not necessarily flow into more open models or open data that humanitarian sector ideally depends on. So this is a very evident idea, not to mention issues like gender, or other spectrums like sexuality not necessarily being represented in data effectively, and depends on where the geography is. So, and it's again easy to say that the response should come from the sector as whole, but there is already a kind of a curated research on this area that starts to make some difference. Like UNICEF is already talking about what should lexicons look like, and some of the work that BRAC does, for example, Kuldeep, I'm sure you can talk more to that, is it's kind of bringing in the community centricity on design itself, that can match up to the larger exclusion and the smaller exclusion. I'm making it kind of a crucial difference between the large and small e exclusion, I suppose. This then will also kind of act on the major risk for AI in general, but here as well on dual use. On whether the models, the technology that's been put to use, especially at the field operator level, it depends on whether there is due protection in place for how the use cases are defined, whether access is kind of justified, and whether that models can kind of like leak into other use like losing of control, or dual use, specifically in case of like specific threat oriented area, because in humanitarian and crisis situation that becomes an extra layer of risk that we need to be aware of. So that it again needs a kind of an overarching framework in which this would be analyzed before it gets deployed, and that has to come from again at the level of the ecosystem and individual organizations kind of trying to match that up. If enough is done to see that individual organizations don't have a pathway to engage with the larger framework at an ecosystem level, much like what is happening in the overall AI ecosystem, where companies and individual member states and countries come together and ask for this, at the humanitarian sector level, that would work. And specifically, you know, processes like threat modeling or risk mitigation, those do exist in place in a lot of non-AI, non-technological use cases. A good exercise of mapping that would be the main aim to responding to risk and accountability. That means that you can ensure there is no lock-in from a specific vendor, knowing what the what the risk would be. There would be mitigation. There would be an appeal channel if ever a risk is triggered. These are all, again, very specific vocabulary that are very well established in literature, in practice. It just has to be ported to the humanitarian cross AI sector a bit more cogently, I would say.
Thank you. Really, again, really interesting points. I'm so happy you're all on the panel. This is great. And I think borrowing from or taking what already exists is something that I think the humanitarian sector does really well already in other areas, because we are so strapped for cash, essentially, strapped for resources. And so I think it's good to kind of call that out, even with AI, because there's so much within, especially Gen AI, generative AI, that you can just take it off the shelf and apply it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the safe way or the appropriate way of using that tool, but it is tempting. And so I think that having a step back and looking at what sort of accountability frameworks we can take from elsewhere to apply, or what others already exist, and in particular, seeing use cases within and by and for the sector really, really help kind of bring that to life. Translating one framework from one sector to another, to our sector. And on this, and carrying on about design in particular, Kuldeep, could you talk a little bit about what design choices help to mitigate these risks from the start?
I think one of the major challenges with AI is, especially in light of how we have failed to communicate the challenges of digital transformation to our clients on the ground already, is to share the real risk and challenges of what happens when AI goes wrong to our clients. I just give an example of words not being sort of communities not even sort of realizing the gravity of these words. There isn't a translation for the word privacy in Hindi, Bengali, Nepali, Bhutanese, or any South Asian language, right? So that means that how would someone who's in Cox's Bazar in the Rohingya camps, how can a frontline worker explain what the concepts of privacy is to our clients? And then that means that where does the consent come from when we are using AI for voice, ambient listening, or we're using it for recording private information, of clients? These things, we're really struggling right now in the field relating to this, of how to communicate the risks and accountability layers of AI solutions to our clients. We can, and most of the time technology developers are just not even trying to tackle that issue. And we just say that, oh, this is a new technology. And we're using traditional communication languages where we aren't doing enough of that. So I don't have an answer to what's the best way, but I really am, to be honest, really struggling with it.
Thanks. I mean, I think that is the best example you could pull in for this sort of thing is literally not being able to translate this, and it's a fundamental piece of the messaging around how to prevent and mitigate risks and identify them. And then if you think it's not just the word, it's the entire culture and acceptance around what that means, and then that obviously waterfalls to other tools within languages, how to communicate. So I think that's a really interesting piece to the puzzle. And again, it also makes me think of where outside of AI, where do we do that well already, where we could potentially apply that, in our design choices. And I know you've worked a lot on innovation and really human-centered design. And do you feel that those other models would be able to be applied to this challenge, or do you think that there's sort of another wall or barrier to overcome?
Yeah, as I said, we feel that even in the digital transformation area, right? I mean, previous to AI, and it has been one of my criticisms. It's also coming in from the development sector as well. I mean, humanitarian sector is a lot more protected in that sense, but the development sector is a wild west, and we're going to also again get the same in onslaught of use cases that really not explained to the user around these risks coming from the development sector. Even though I'm like in the middle of that, like with Brack and with others, I see that as an issue. We're relating to how use cases, how we can design it according to the communities, wishes and desires. I think we have to go back to the basics of first principles of the feature set that is allowed. Every feature that is being used in around AI in that particular solution has to be explained how that happens, and then what happens if something goes wrong with it. So we have to give clear examples of every feature set, and we should not make our technology sounds like magic. It sometimes it feels really nice to say that, oh, voila, it automatically does everything and it'll do all of these things for you, but we don't explain how this thing happens to our users, and then why, if you do it more of that, like the do's and don'ts of each of the solutions has to be elements of the solution, not just a solution, but elements of AI usage in that solution has to be explained to the user.
Absolutely. And I think it must then be, or it is, an additional challenge too, if we can't explain it, if we can't explain it because we're not developing it, or if we don't have access to it, or if the developers can't explain it, in a really thorough way, if it's black box in some way, that's an additional challenge.
AI is something that we can't explain right now. I cannot explain, to be honest. I'll tell you, I cannot explain what happens when I share personal client data into a chatbot. Like, what happens? What does the company do? Where does the data go? Whether the data gets utilized or misused, I really don't know how to explain it myself. And as I said, that is why I feel like this is, I'm struggling with it myself.
Absolutely. Over to Bill, wanting to bring you back into this conversation. As we're sort of thinking about trying to mitigate risks, trying to even get a handle on what we're talking about. There's also the rest of the ecosystem and working together, and the challenges with that, but also the opportunities with working with networks, and how funders, for instance, are driving a lot of the agenda around AI and around technology use in the humanitarian sector. We hear a lot about we need efficient use of resources. We're seeing funding for pilots and sort of shorter term funding. So from your perspective, how can networks and funders shift the incentives so that AI really empowers or supports rather than sidelines, or worse, local humanitarian responders?
Again, thanks, Elizabeth. I think I'll literally be building on where Kuldeep left it at, because he literally started touching on that in most of his points. Especially while designing these tools, and they really want to localize it to the most possible levels. I think to your question, how networks and funders shift incentives so AI can empower but not sideline. I think the one risk that we've seen with AI is centralizing power itself. For example, these tools are mostly developed and owned by large tech companies or NGOs, maybe in the global north. If there are any NGOs that are building their tools now, and if those tools are rolled out without the local adaptation, then smaller NGOs may become passive or just end users, just like all of us use tools like ChatGPT and all that. But the best case scenario would be if these people become actual partners, but not passive users, because the moment they become end users, then we risk widening the digital divide instead of closing it. Again, I want to believe that funders or even networks like ours should incentivize a local capacity building, not just all these shiny new tools. So instead of, for example, funding only the deployment of an AI platform, donors could require that a portion of these grants that we have go into training local staff in data literacy, ethics, and validation. Shyam mentioned something around the local or the responders being able to validate these tools. How will they validate these tools if they do not have the training or even the expertise to do that? So if some of the grants could go into that, then that will also be a very proper way of incentivizing it. For instance, I can also speak about I saw recently a tool for an AI-driven tool for an early warning system kind of. And when I was thinking through that, relating it to this question now, that could include a grant towards that could include a budget line for training local responders to interpret the outputs and even challenge errors that could come from such tools. Again, being aware of time here, I would also speak to. I mean, this could come out controversially, but networks, again, like our networks, could act as brokers. And trying to explain that, I would say, for example, Start Network could, or even NetHope could, or even BRAC, which is a very big player again, could negotiate shared access to AI-powered platforms. For example, if it is a tool for analyzing crisis data or managing, donor pipelines out there, they could contribute to that access across the members within their networks. That way we would realize that smaller NGOs don't each have to pay for expensive licenses for these tools or develop systems on their own. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. A parallel here, or an equivalent that I could compare to that, is how maybe Start Network, that I know much of, already pools risk financing for members, so that AI could again get treated as a similar resource that can be a more of a shared resource than a singularly owned resource by some big tech company somewhere. I mean, just like we have the Twitter and the Facebooks and all the rest. And then finally, again, before I give this back to you, Elizabeth, AI must remain decision support and not decision making. I think that has really been echoed a lot. A clear example is in our use case for the 72-hour alert system. When we respond to alerts across the world, AI could, for example, surface historical response data that highlights trends and even suggest possible interventions. And we're already building this out within Start Network, by the way. So as much as it can highlight all these trends and historical and suggest possible interventions, we don't want it to tell us that, an earthquake has happened in Congo, this is what you need to do. No, we want AI to support decision towards what is supposed to be done. And by this, the decision will always remain with the members who understand the local cultural, political, or even social dynamics. In that way, again, the point about human validation remains very much in place and remains essential to keep community voices at the center of all these AI interventions. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. That is a fantastic transition, I think, over to our audience participation and then even into our next section. Sophia or Derek, if you wanted to share.
Yeah, so I think we got a question in the chat that really segues well to the next question that you'll have. So can and how AI and community-centered approach really decolonize technology, reduce bias, empower communities, ensure inclusivity, and enhance localization? And this is from Anna at Code NGO.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really fantastic question, and it almost feels a little rhetorical. So I think, but just because I do think that this segues really well to our next question, I'll kind of carry forward, and then maybe we can bring in those answers or perspectives from our panelists. So our next question is on balancing innovation and community-centered approaches. And so when thinking about introducing AI into humanitarian programs, what strategies can program managers use to balance the drive for technological innovation with approaches that do remain grounded in community priorities? There's as we are ourselves talking today, and what we hear in our ecosystem is that there is a lot of opportunities around AI, but how do we ensure that those gains are realized, and also consider how we measure them? So I think thinking about this topic and Anna's really excellent question on decolonizing technology and really empowering communities and ensuring inclusivity, and so on. Maybe we could start with Kuldeep. If you have thoughts on this question, on what promising ways to co-design AI tools with affected communities and local responders, if we could maybe start there.
Yeah. Again, I'll go back to the thing that this is another issue that the humanitarian sector has failed at. Localization humanitarian sector as collectively has failed at localization, and we're bearing the results of that failure right now. So it's again like, and it again then becomes a more challenging issue in the space of AI. The interesting thing though is that, like, you mentioned that garbage in, garbage out angle. I mean, the more localized AI is, the localized data and localized data sources we get, the more value of that we can extract out of AI. So in a sense that, you can only make good quality AI tool if you are localizing. So it also becomes now a forcing mechanism for humanitarian agencies. If they are using AI tools in a much more integrated manner, they have to ensure that there is localized data, there is localized capacity to manage that tool, and also localized capacity to understand the risks and mitigate those risks. So I see now AI as a forcing mechanism in a sector that has failed at localization, but now has to be forced into look into localization, even in a situation where there is no enough resource, without looking at the resource implications of it. So that's the point on localization. With relating to like how that can be done, in a co-design manner. I think we have to really again go back to the concept of like, this concept of forward deployed designers, where the technology solution designers are at the ground working with the frontline workers, are at the ground with the users and clients to really understand what the data inflow is, what is really required, and then find a mechanism to bring that information back to them, right? Otherwise, right, again, the community healthcare workers enter all that data information, and which they will never see it coming back to them. And it's one of the failures, again, like we've used all that digitization for reporting purposes only, rather than using it for actual use cases that helps the frontline workers or helps the user. So that has to be the case. We cannot go back to this like using AI for dashboard creation for CEOs of humanitarian agencies. That's like the worst way to build solutions. And again, because it is an add-on resource on top of existing digitization, it's going to cost the organization. So we cannot build AI tools that are not feeding back into the frontline workers and back into the users on the ground. So there's this idea of forward deployed designers, even forward deployed engineers and software developers can help us get out of that like Western Copenhagen or Geneva mindset of stacking all the developers and technologists there and expecting technology to be utilized in Uganda, in Cox's Bazar, for example.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I saw you got some thumbs up from Anna. And I think it's a really interesting point, both on the sort of failures around localization, and you've mentioned this before too in your answers about really bringing it back to basics. And this has been around, this concept of localization has been a priority for the sector for, gosh, almost 10 years now, at least, since it was put in writing. And and I'm sure beyond that in practice. And I think if we still haven't made good on that in a sort of measurable, impactful way across the whole sector, then it is something that we would need to fix in order for AI to be relevant, useful, safe, and so on and so forth, and not replicating those colonialist structures that we see across other forms of technology and also just general humanitarian practice. I think that's a really interesting point. I'm conscious of time. We are on our last sort of block of big questions. I'm going to come to Shyam and Bill for their sort of pieces to this question, and then we'll have like a rapid round before we close out. So just to kind of give everyone a sort of a 12-minute warning or so. But Shyam, if I could come to you, building off of what Kuldeep has said and sort of the conversation writ large, thinking a lot about organizational cultures too, knowing that this is very much, as much as we want to talk about AI as a technological beast, there is so much that is dependent on an organizational culture, on leadership, taking direction, and so on. So how do we create organizational cultures that value innovation without compromising dignity and agency?
Sure. Thank you. I think agency is kind of a good word to end your question on, because I can pick up on that. Some areas that, especially the question that was in the chat, and kind of widening out participation, and some aspects that Kuldeep mentioned as well. For me, it comes down to on forward place designers. Is that the right word? I'm thinking. Kind of putting that
Forward
into practice.
deployed.
Forward deployed designers, kind of thinking about that more practically on what that would mean, but also more strategically to provide ownership at the community level. One strategy I've been kind of like advocating, it's not just for the humanitarian sector, it is widely understood in AI context as well. Product ownership, kind of liaison, data owner, data collection ownership has to be named at the community level. So, because some aspects of this has been kind of tested on largely global north, minority country context. They've been doing this, especially in case of energy security, where there is a local liaison there's an energy security liaison that works with energy companies in ensuring that the translation of the needs is professionally maintained, and they're given that recognition and ownership. I think that's missing in the humanitarian sector. In multiple areas, there is centricity of the community, but not ownership enough. And in AI, even if it is unexplainable, I'll come to that point, just in a bit. That unexplainability is a secondary concern. It is about the ownership, that they are asking for explainability. They're asking for that epistemic partnership, that meaning making. That is more important. I think that would be a strong strategy I would suggest. And then explainability. There is a larger understanding in AI that ensuring explainability is a big resource task for AI companies. There would be we cannot be hung up too much on attaining that perfectly. But the idea that someone in the community would be asking the question and creating a pathway, creating a recourse for that, so eventually explainability would be resolved, is useful. An example in other cases, like traffic laws, safety of automobiles, is not always explainable, but the end use of it has to be understood by someone who's impacted by those technologies. This metaphor has been thrown very imperfectly. I'm using it again in that sense. But the idea is that it keeps the conversation open and not close it, because explainability is defined too technically or too algorithmic oriented. But it should be more about the end impact than anything else. I'll stop at that, because for sake of time.
Thank you. Gosh, I just want to carry this conversation on for another couple of hours. But I think this is a good transition over to Bill. With your technical expertise and from your perspective, who can safely implement AI programs now? Thinking of our audience in particular, field teams, program managers, leaders of organizations, what do we all need to consider, or even what skills do we need to have to start innovating while bearing in mind, this balance and community-centered approach?
Yeah, I mean, thanks again, Elizabeth. And again, picking it on with the same tempo, I think quickly to your question, who can implement AI programs now? I think at this stage, because there are frameworks and things we need in place to properly implement AI, I'd say large AI NGOs and networks with established, digital governance, data protection policies, IT security. I mean, the list can go on and on, but those are the ones that are best positioned to roll out AI responsibly. And they can literally test, they can fail safely. I mean, there are people, if they fail in these implementations, then there's no recovering from that. But larger NGOs can fail safely. We can all attest to that, and they can as well refine without putting communities at risk. That said, I think smaller NGOs shouldn't be excluded as well. If tools are modular, more transparent, and co-designed, having them in thought, they can benefit as well. For example, I could say an example would be a lightweight chatbot that helps summarize, for example, lessons from previous experiences or a project that is a tool that can be safely used by some small community organization without the need for full AI infrastructure. On the next part of this question on, what should they consider? I would summarize that into the humanitarian context, where most of our teams are divided into three layers. It is either the field teams, the program managers, and the leaders at the SLT and SMT levels. So starting with the actual responders down here who are in the field teams, I think the key skill there is we don't want them to be, for example, programmers or developers or coders. The key skill they need there is digital literacy, and being able to question AI outputs and ask, does this reflect what we see on the ground, rather than just accepting them blindly. So if AI, for example, suggests that the cost of rebuilding this house that has gone down due to an earthquake is, $1,000, they should be able to ask how that information was grounded. Maybe that is information from 5 years ago, which inflation at the moment won't allow $1,000 to bring up that house again. So they should have that capability to question those answers that come from AI. The other group, program leads or program managers, they need to consider ethics and accountability again. They need to be able to test bias, ensuring that outputs respect community priorities, correcting problems early. And finally, the last group that I would speak to, being conscious of time again, is leaders. These are one of the most important groups of people. Leadership must drive the culture shift. Framing AI as a tool to augment or to support, not replace human decision making, because they sit at the levels where they can either make such calls. I think I'll give it back to you, Elizabeth. I think time is still on our side. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Again, really, really fascinating contribution and really great conversation so far. We are stretched for time, so I'm gonna come to our last question, and then I've just added a comment in the chat about the compendium of case studies if you'd like to check that out. But we're gonna kind of go through a rapid response question. Thinking about moving into the future, how can networks like the START Network help redistribute or equalize access and opportunities when it comes to the benefits of AI, so that all of these organizations not only not get left behind, but really thrive in this technological era? So maybe I'll start with Bill. What models of open access, shared data, or capacity building could realistically work? If you could just have 1 minute on this.
Okay. Still unmute. Yeah, really quickly on that. One way networks can equalize access is by creating shared AI platforms and data sets, because this AI, most of these AI, models rely on data sets, and we can create, shared resources around that, so that small organizations don't have to reinvent the wheel, as we had mentioned earlier. And then quickly around that, we also need open, anonymized humanitarian datasets where both local and international actors can contribute and even benefit from. And of course, capacity building is key. Let me not forget that. And lastly, where networks really shine is by making sure the benefits that will come from AI are not locked up with the biggest players, but shared equitably across the system amongst even smaller players. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Brilliant. 1 minute. Fantastic. Thank you. Over to you, Shyam. How can global policies and donor requirements shift to support equitable access?
Thank you. I think a value chain perspective of looking at across model requirements, data requirements, and user requirements all coming together would be necessary. And within that, I would say resource allocation and budgeting has to have a localization lens. Allocate a percentage of budget that needs to be addressed only in the localized context and not just as a technological overarching AI context would be a good starting point. So funding and resourcing and management all kind of align on localization as priority. And within each of these kind of value chain areas, what would recourse look like? How do we kind of ensure human review of it, and participant and community being able to go back and question decisions made, ergo eventually transparency and explainability being achieved, even if it's imperfect in the start, would be a good way to go. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. All right, Kuldeep, I think you're going to bring us home. What role do you see experimentation playing across networks in shaping this more inclusive AI future?
Yeah, I think we need to do more on doing collective experiments. We have to find ways to engage together and do collective bargaining on compute access as well. I mean, we're expecting a lot of compute deficiency to happen in the coming years as these companies will decide to prioritize their own sort of R&D work in favor of humanitarian use cases and development sector use cases. So we need to experiment. We need to also document those experimentation in a manner of not just showing successful ones, but also create some failure reports. I think this would be my request for NetHope and START to sort of look at potentially creating failure reports around AI usage and really dig into design on why they failed and how they failed and what to avoid. Because I think at this moment we need to know what not to do more than like what to do. BRAC has a failure report on all of our programs failures that we churn out on a biannual basis. I know it's a big cultural shift, but I think we have to address those cultural shifts of understanding and embracing failures so that we can share it to the rest of the network, what to avoid and what to do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Really wise words to end on. So a huge thank you to our panelists. I really appreciate you coming together and having this discussion. You're seeing the claps in the chat pop up. Thank you so much to the START Network for providing this platform for this conversation and for supporting this event. And thank you to the audience. And sorry, we've sort of rushed through that ending, but I really appreciate the participation and a dose of realism in this conversation and getting to explore this in depth. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day.